August 15th, 2018, 11 in the morning. A woman sits across from a man in a small room and begins strapping sensors to his body, 2 rubber tubes around his chest and abdomen, a blood pressure cuff on his upper arm, electrodes on his fingertips, pressure pads beneath his seat, beneath his arms, registering every shift of weight. 12 hours ago, this same man stood in front of television cameras and begged for his family to come home. Now, he's wired to a machine that measures 3 things simultaneously: breathing rate, sweat response, and heart activity, comparing his body's reaction to harmless questions against his reaction to the ones that actually matter. She asks him 3 questions. Do you know where Shanann is now? Did you physically cause Shanann's disappearance? Are you lying about the last time you saw Shanann? He answers no to all 3. The machine scores him at -18. The threshold for deception is -4. He's more than 4 times past the cutoff. But here's what matters. The polygraph didn't crack Chris Watts. What happened in the 6 hours after it did? On one side of the table sits CBI agent Tammy Lee. CBI is the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, the state-level agency that handles major crimes local departments can't resource on their own. Lee is a certified forensic polygraph examiner. Her job is to read the machine, but more importantly, to read the person sitting in the chair. Beside her, waiting in the wings, is FBI Special Agent Graham Coder. The FBI routinely embeds behavioral analysts in high-profile local investigations when the interrogation requires a level of psychological precision that goes beyond standard interview training. Coder is that specialist. Trained in behavioral analysis and interrogation, his voice has been described as soft, soothing almost. But the questions he asks are designed to dismantle you. If the FBI sent someone, investigators are already treating this as the worst possible scenario. On the other side sits Chris Watts, 33 years old, field operator for Anadarko Petroleum, the oil and gas company that gave him unsupervised access to remote well sites across northeastern Colorado. He's married to Shanann. They have 2 daughters, Bella, 4, Celeste, 3. Shanann is 15 weeks pregnant with a boy they planned to name Nico, and as of 48 hours ago, all 3 of them are missing. Here's what the investigators know, and what Watts doesn't know they know. They have no bodies, no crime scene, no physical evidence linking him to a crime, and under Colorado law, a polygraph result is inadmissible in court. It can never be entered as evidence. It's purely a psychological tool. Watts's leverage is simple. He can stand up, walk out, and if he asks for a lawyer, the interview ends. He hasn't been arrested. He hasn't been charged. But Watts doesn't understand any of this. He thinks the polygraph is a machine that just caught him lying, and Lee and Coder plan to let him keep believing exactly that. So why would investigators stake everything on a test that can never be used? Because they don't need it in a courtroom. They need it in his head. Lee begins the pre-test interview. Calm, procedural, deliberately non-threatening. She opens by telling Watts that right now, only one person in this room knows the truth. But the cool thing is, by the end of the test, 2 of them will. She lets him talk, lets him rehearse his cover story. Shanann mentioned going to a friend's house with the kids, and that was the last he heard. It was very vague, his words. Lee doesn't challenge him. She takes notes. She watches. What she notices is what Coder will later use. Watts doesn't just deny involvement, he performs concern. He craves being seen as the good guy, the worried husband, the cooperative witness. This is a man whose identity depends on other people's approval. Then she runs the polygraph. The technique works like this. Before the real questions, Lee asks Watts to deliberately lie about something minor, whether he has ever told a lie to avoid trouble. The machine reads his body while he lies on purpose. It learns what deception looks like specifically in him, in his breathing, in his sweat, and his heart rate, before the questions that actually matter begin. During this calibration phase, Lee actually thanks Watts for being awesome at being a terrible liar. She's warm, she's friendly, she's collecting data. 3 charts, 3 relevant questions. The results come back catastrophic. -18 on a scale where -4 means deception. Lee returns to the room with Coder. They've placed a printed photograph of Bella and Celeste on the table. Lee tells him plainly, "You did not pass." Chris says okay. She doesn't dramatize, she states a number. And then something happens that separates the guilty from the innocent. Watts doesn't argue the science, doesn't demand a retest, doesn't say the machine is broken. He goes quiet. An innocent person fights. Watts accepts. Lee and Coder now understand they're in a confession negotiation. But before Watts ever sat down in that chair, the investigation had already moved. 3 hours before the polygraph began, Lee received a phone call from Anadarko's regional security manager, Tony Husky. Husky had reviewed Watts' computer network traffic and found emails between Watts and a contracted employee named Nickel Kessinger, a co-worker he'd been having an affair with since June 2018. Weeks into the affair, Kessinger's phone data showed she had spent 2 hours browsing wedding dresses online. This was not a casual distraction. This was someone planning a future, which meant Watts was planning one too. And the family standing between him and that future was Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and a son not yet born. The relationship he was most terrified investigators would discover because it destroyed the only story he had. Lee now possesses this information. She hasn't revealed it. She's holding it like a card she can play at the exact right moment. Coder takes over. His approach oscillates between 2 forces designed to mirror what's happening inside Watts' own mind, empathy and inevitability. On one hand, he minimizes the moral weight. I think something happened and it wasn't planned. You're not a monster. On the other, he maximizes the certainty of being caught. The evidence is going to come out either way, and the only question is whether your side of the story is part of it. You're probably wondering why Coder sounds almost gentle with a man he suspects of killing his own family. This isn't sympathy, it's architecture. Before entering the room, Lee and Coder had coordinated their roles. Lee would deliver the polygraph result as cold, numerical fact. Coder would immediately follow with warmth, framing confession as the path back to being seen as a good person. The split was designed around a specific read on Watts' psychology. His fear of being caught and his need to be liked were 2 levers pulling in the same direction. Coder's job was to build a version of the crime that Watts could confess to without seeing himself as a monster. Not because Coder believed that version, because a partial confession, even a false one, is a door that only opens one way. Back in the room, the external pressure is closing in. Nickel Atkinson, Shanann's close friend, had dropped Shanann off at 1:48 a.m. and called 911 barely 12 hours later when Shanann missed a doctor's appointment and stopped answering her phone. Shanann worked from home for Lavelle, a direct sales company, which meant her social media presence was constant and her silence was noticed almost immediately. Her phone was found between the couch cushions. Her purse, with her keys and medication, was still inside the house. Her car, with the girls' car seats, was still in the garage. Her wedding ring sat on the bedside table. Taken together, none of these things could be explained by a woman who simply left. Every item she would have taken was still there. Every item a person stages a disappearance without would be missing. Nothing was missing. Everything pointed back to the house and the man inside it. Then there was the neighbor. Nathan Trinastic's surveillance camera had captured Watts loading his truck in the early morning, 3 trips between the house and the vehicle, carrying something, loading items not into the truck bed but into the cab. Trinastic told an officer that Watts seemed fidgety, rocking back and forth while watching himself on his own surveillance footage. The GPS in Watts' work truck showed he left the house at 5:46 a.m. and arrived 47 minutes later at a remote oil field called Cervi 319, an Anadarko well site 40 miles east of Frederick. A site Watts had serviced dozens of times and knew no one would visit for days. Coder keeps referencing someone else without naming Kessinger. He lets Watts feel the walls moving. He lets pauses stretch to 30, 40 seconds, forcing Watts to fill the silence. 5 hours in, Watts is cornered. And then he says the word, lawyer. The room's energy changes. Lee and Coder know the math. If Watts formally requests counsel, everything stops. They have minutes, maybe less, and this is where they make the decision the logline promised, the move that sounds insane. Watts asks to speak to his dad. Ronnie Watts had flown in that morning from the other side of the country. He's been sitting in the building the entire time. Lee and Coder have spent 6 hours reading Chris Watts, and they've identified his single vulnerability. Not guilt, not God, not justice. The need to be understood by his father. Lee later said there were so many things in play at that moment. It was such a risky move, and they had to make a split-second decision on whether or not they could allow Ronnie Watts into the interrogation room. The risk was obvious. Ronnie could tell his son to shut up. Ronnie could demand a lawyer. Ronnie could comfort him into silence. But Coder told Watts the hallways were full of people. They offered to bring Ronnie in on one condition: Watts would tell his dad what happened. Ronnie walks in wearing a polo shirt with Papa Ronnie embroidered on the chest. Father and son embrace. Lee and Coder step out and watch from the observation room. This is what Lee called the make or break moment. Chris whispers, "She hurt them, and I freaked out and did the same thing to her." A confession, but a false one. The version where Shanann killed the girls and Watts killed Shanann in a rage, designed to make him look like a father who snapped, not a man who planned 3 murders. And the whole time, Lee has been watching something specific. Throughout hours of conversation, Watts keeps touching his throat. His hands drift toward his neck. He rests his arm against his throat in various positions. Lee had flagged this gesture early on. Coder had actually stepped out of the room at one point and told her he may have strangled her. The gesture was unconscious, a man describing what happened to his wife while his hands involuntarily moved toward the method he'd used to kill her. Lee didn't need the full truth yet. She needed the door open. 36 minutes pass between father and son. Then Ronnie does the one thing the investigators feared. He starts telling his son to get a lawyer. "Well, you gotta get a lawyer. See what we can do." Within 10 seconds, Lee and Coder are back in the room. Lee sits directly beside Watts, her elbow almost touching his. She rubs his shoulder. She comforts a man she is likely repulsed by. She doesn't show it. She holds her nerve and keeps him in the game. Then, on the record, my babies are gone, and I put my hands around my wife's neck, and I did that same thing. Watts marks an aerial photograph, an S where Shanann is buried, a B and a C on 2 oil tanks. Investigators arrive at Cervi 319 at 11 that night. Shanann is in a shallow grave, curled in a fetal position, face down. The 2 oil tanks have openings only 8 inches in diameter. It takes 6 hours to drain a single tank. At the bottom of each, buried in crude oil sludge, still in her nightgown, one of his daughters. Shanann's family was asked whether they wanted the death penalty pursued. They said no. They did not wish for any further deaths. Let that sit for a moment. The people with the most right to want the worst possible outcome chose otherwise. Watts pleads guilty on November 6, 2018. He receives 5 consecutive life sentences without parole, plus an additional 48 years for the unlawful termination of Shanann's pregnancy, and 36 years for 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. In February 2019, Watts is interviewed again at Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin and recants his earlier version entirely. He admits he killed all 3, strangled Shanann in bed, then drove Bella and Celeste to the oil site alive. The girl's mother was at their feet for the entire 47-minute drive. At the site, he smothered Celeste first with a blanket. Bella sat beside her sister and watched. When he came back for Bella, she asked him, "Is the same thing gonna happen to me as Cece?" He told her yes. Her last words were, "Daddy, no." The autopsy had already told this story. Bite marks on the inside of Bella's tongue, consistent with a 4-year-old clenching her jaw while being suffocated. No drugs in any of the victim's systems. They were awake. So what did 2 investigators actually do in that room? 3 things. First, Lee used the polygraph as theater. The test is inadmissible. Its power exists entirely inside the subject's belief in it. She didn't present the result as an accusation. She presented it as a number, -18, and she let Watts do the math himself. Second, Coder built a psychological container Watts could step into. Empathy lowered the cost of speaking. Inevitability raised the cost of staying silent. He never told Watts what to confess. He built a version of events where confession felt like relief rather than surrender. The partial story Watts told his father, that Shanann had hurt the girls and he had reacted, was constructed to protect Watts' self-image. Coder understood that. He let the false version open the door, knowing the door, once open, could not be closed. Third, and most precisely, they brought in Ronnie Watts when a lawyer was 10 seconds away. That decision required reading 6 hours of a man's psychology, identifying the one relationship that outweighed self-preservation, and betting on it in real time with no margin for error. The bet was correct, and from the moment Chris Watts whispered to his father in that room, the outcome was sealed. 3 people had already been murdered before the first sensor was attached to Watts's body. What Lee and Coder did in that room didn't save anyone. What it did was find them, and in the end, finding them was the only thing left that could be done.